We were talking last hour about history and how we need to preserve it. And, Stu brought up a great name in the break, and that is Clarence Thomas. Somebody needs to start pushing in your city council for a Clarence Thomas Boulevard.
Yeah.
That one would spark some outrage.
Antonin Scalia.
That'd be great.
I mean, that would be fantastic. Because I think...
I like Rush Limbaugh Boulevard, quite honestly.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Because I feel like George Washington, it's easy for progressives because he's such an iconic figure. Even though they disagree with everything he stood for, they'll throw George Washington to you. I mean, you got to work to get Rush Limbaugh Boulevard. That's what, and that sends a message, and that is something that over a long period of time people will be like, "Oh, Rush Limbaugh, I thought he was a bad guy, but he's got a street named after him, so maybe I should look back into that."
We should find out in West Palm. Wouldn't that be great? You should get the West Palm. You should start a deal to name a street after Rush Limbaugh. He's paid enough in taxes in your town.
Yeah, no kidding. He should own all the streets in your town. Get a street named, name all of your streets Rush Limbaugh Boulevard. But get a Rush Limbaugh Boulevard. There should be a Clarence Thomas. Where was Clarence Thomas born? But I think even more, it shouldn't just be where they're born. These guys are heroes to America, and they should be in all these places. Just like, Martin Luther King Boulevard isn't just where Martin Luther King was born. It's all over the country.
But I believe it started there. I believe it probably started there.
Maybe it did. It probably did. But the left will give you things occasionally, and I don't know what the process was, but you got Reagan International Airport. That's like there's certain things that they'll give you, but Rush Limbaugh would drive them crazy. Absolutely nuts.
See, I will tell you that I'm not saying to do this to drive people crazy. I'm saying to make sure that when your kids are driving down the street and they say, where is that? You turn left on Cesar Chavez Boulevard. After a while, nobody knows that Cesar Chavez is a bad guy because he's got streets named after him.
Mm-hmm.
So they are making all of us look like bad guys. So let's make sure that there are Ronald Reagan Boulevards, that there are Rush Limbaugh Boulevards. There are the 20th century and the 18th and 17th century guys as well.
Didn't you talk about this, Glenn? Didn't the founders talk about leaving true history in architecture?
Jefferson did. He said, if you really want to preserve American history, or preserve history, forget about books. Now, he's a guy who said, I can't live in a world without books. He said, forget about books. You embed it in architecture. And quite honestly, that's what the Knights Templar, that was their idea as well. If you look at the big cathedrals over in Europe, they buried all of their truths in the carvings in the statues. You'll go to the National Cathedral, same thing. If you go to the National Cathedral, you'll see the moon launch is carved in the cathedral, and it's in the stained glass as well. You'll see all of American history in the National Cathedral, and that really kind of comes anciently, but in America, that comes from Jefferson saying embedded in architecture.
Well, look at New York City. Look how much, and we've talked about a lot of it, and sadly, a lot of it's progressive in nature or even socialist in nature, but there's history carved all through New York and Midtown Manhattan in the architecture. You look at 30 Rock and the symbolism there with all the Mussolini references. It's amazing. It's amazing how they carved it into architecture.
But nobody knows it.
Yeah.
And here's the interesting thing. When you go down to Battery Park, which is right down by the Statue of Liberty, you look at the Customs House. And the Customs House, and they knew back then, 20th century, the progressives knew. And in the Customs House, if you look up as you're standing there, this is the place where everybody came through. All of the ships came through the Customs House. So it's this giant thing right at the edge of Battery Park. And you look up at the top, and all around are statues of the different peoples and the different parts of the world. Well, the Germans, and this happened after World War I, the Germans the big guy from Germany has a shield and a sword. His sword was chiseled off after World War I because they never wanted to show the Germans as having any kind of power at all. And so if you look at the statue, if you look at the building, that was changed. We don't even look up at those things anymore. We don't even notice. When they were originally done, they were done for a reason. And they were done to have us look up. Most people, it's amazing. I've always said that my ultimate job would be to retire and just take people on a tour of Washington and New York. David has to teach me the Washington, D.C. history. I know a bit of it, and I can show you the symbolism. We were driving by the Federal Trade Commission the other day, and there's a guy with a horse who is grabbing onto the reins, and he is pulling back that horse. And you just look at it, and you're like, oh, it's a guy with a horse, and he's just pulling it. Well, why is it in front of the Federal Trade Commission? What is that? What does that mean? Horses in art, especially around the turn of the century, usually represent industry. And so what he's doing is he's throwing the reins around industry, and he is holding back industry. That's why the Federal Trade Commission has in front of it the horse and the guy holding it back. But most people walk by it and they don't even think.
They don't know the symbolism at all.
They don't know it at all. And it's everywhere. It's in every single town.
Another thing we learned on the last trip to D.C. with David was that the number of hooves the horse has on the ground are representative of whether the soldier on top of it died in battle or not.
Right, or was wounded. If there's wounded. If you look at a statue, at least in Washington, D.C., if you look at a statue and there is one hoof raised, it means he was wounded in battle. If the horse is rearing up and both hooves are up, it means he died in battle. I didn't know that.
And if all four hooves are down, he survived. So, and was not wounded.
Right.
Really interesting. I had no idea. So they did. I mean, our forebears did embed history.
And they're doing, and we're doing it now, except we're just doing it with naming streets.
Yeah.
We're doing it by putting up mindless. Look at what we're doing. Look at what we've replaced. We've replaced the statues that we were just talking about. We've just talked about, let's use the Federal Trade Commission. That is telling us something about what's happening in that building. You look at the horses and the generals in Washington, D.C., that tells you something about the nation's history. The woman on top of the Capitol building, every bit of that is symbolism. Every bit of it. In fact, her helmet was to be originally a liberty cap, something that came back was a symbol, again, used in art. It was a symbol used by the French to say you are a freed man. You're a free slave. Well, the South didn't want to have anything to do with it. And the guy who was casting it, who was put in charge of casting it, actually was so anti-North and so pro-slavery that he had it cast by slaves. So that symbol up on top of our Capitol was intentionally cast by slaves as a sign because he forced them to remove the liberty cap, and the artist pushed back, and the North, it was a big debate. This is, I think, 1856. Liberty cap was removed. He then took it to the South and granted the casting to a company in the South that was intentionally using slaves, and then he put it up there. 4 years later, Mr. Davis, Jefferson Davis, led the South to secession. That's who was in charge of that. There's history absolutely everywhere, and nobody looks at it. And we've replaced those things that you can look at and identify with what? With giant orange steel beams that sit in the middle of our streets and we don't have any idea? I was driving out of Orlando a couple of months ago or 6 months ago, and I was driving to the airport, and at the airport there's this giant steel structure, just these beams, and they're all painted orange or red, and it's ridiculous and it's ugly. And that's fine. If you like modern art that's meaningless, that's fine. You want to find meaning in it? Great. Good for you. Meaningless. Well, it's the angles that... Shut up. So you like that? Fine. You can make that all you want. But what does it say? You go 2,000 years from now when they're digging up our relics and all of this stuff is buried in Orlando, they're going to find that stupid orange steel structure. What's it going to say? Well, if they find one of the parks, they'll say there must have been some sort of amusement center here as well. They look at your architecture. They look at your structure. They will look at Space Mountain when it's buried and they're digging it up with little teeny paintbrushes, and they'll be like, it's some steel structure and it goes on forever. It must have been some sort of device that was carrying fruit at high speeds. No, that can't be because we made it to the bottom and the fruit would have been delivered right where it started. And they'll try to figure it out. But the art that we currently are putting in our city squares, nobody's going to figure it out. I don't know, must have been a garbage dump. They started to build a building and then they stopped. I don't know what happened. What does it say about us? Exactly what progressives want the art to say about us. Nothing. Nothing. Have you ever noticed that it's always the progressive, overeducated idiot that goes, oh, well, you just don't understand. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. It's a big canvas painted blue. My 2-year-old could have done that. It means nothing. Well, it means what you shut up. Shut up and sit down. When they dig you up in 2,000 years, maybe you can explain what that one color blue meant. Nobody else is going to be able to figure it out on their own.